Rodney Anonymous of the Dead Milkman on Ambrose, Bierce, and stuff.
Yeah, Devil's Dictionary is one of my favorite reads.
Oh,
Also,
yeah.
Ambrose Bierce had the good sense to disappear. We don't know what happened to him. He went down the Colorado River into Mexico somewhere, and which is perfect for Ambrose Bierce. Yeah, I remember I was oh God, where was I? I was in a bookstore. I used to work in Wilmington, and so it's like a strip mall behind where I worked, and I would go over to the Borders there to eat lunch. And they were reading. They had like the Devil's Dictionary, and I told them, I said immediately turn to. They were just randomly paging. Like turn to accordion, because accordion is one of the the better entries in there, and it's in the beginning. So
accordion, an instrument in harmony with the sentiments of an assassin.
Yeah, Devil's Dictionary is absolutely fantastic, and Occurrence at Owl Creek is a great short story. Yeah, there's a sort of winking sense of humor that runs through his stuff, which is always good. I think that's the best stuff, has that sort of slyness to it. Like Robert Bloch, if you've ever saw interviews with him, he's talking about, he was on I was watching when I was young. He was on like the Tomorrow Show or something with Tom Snyder, which is scary enough. And they had like him on, Mickey Spillane, and I forget who else. And Mickey Spillane was talking about describing the comma-shaped hole that a gun had put in somebody's stomach. And without missing a beat, Robert Bloch was like, if he just aimed a little bit lower, they could have left him with a semicolon.
Welcome once again to an episode of Black Clock Audio Tales. I am your host, DB Spitzer, and once again we will be talking about folklore, gothic literature, spookiness, ghost stories, stuff like that, cosmic horror. But today we're going to be focusing on ghost stories, spooky stories, tales of suspense of Ambrose Bierce, as we've been doing all month long on Black Clock Audio Tales, brought to you by BunnySlippers.com. Check out our new, cool Dino sound slippers. They're foamy, they're soft, they make noise every 3 steps, and they've got stuff so that you don't slip and fall. Just everything a slipper should have. Alright. And check us out everywhere that you can check us out by going to pgttcm.com and looking for us all over social media. Just look for Black Clock Audio Tales, Black Clock Audio, or PGTTCM. And join us for the end of the month where we have our monthly Cthulhu Mythos episode for People's Guide to the Cthulhu Mythos. As Ken Hite described it, we're like a nesting doll of podcasts within podcasts. All right, on with the show. I mean, rate, review, and subscribe anywhere you rate, review, and subscribe, and donate $1 or $5 by going to paypal.me/pgttcm.com. Help us get new equipment and help us pay for the equipment that we already have. Thank you so much. On with the show. Greetings and welcome to Black Clock Audio Tales. We've got another supplemental episode. Not quite a supplemental episode. I don't even know what to call this episode. We'll just call this another episode. But we have a special guest. We have David Flora from Blurry Photos. So, David, welcome to the show.
Hey, I'm David Flora from Blurry Photos.
Yeah, can you tell people, if they don't know who Blurry Photos is who you are and what you do?
What? You don't know Blurry Photos? What are you doing? What are you doing with your life?
That's that podcast about how not to be a photographer, right?
Oh my gosh, yeah, right? Somebody told me that blurryphotos.com, which is not my website, is the website for Jason Lee, who is of My Name is Earl fame.
I was going to say the skateboarder?
Maybe, is that, I don't, maybe, like, I'm so far removed from it, I don't even know, but blurryphotos.org is where you can find the podcast Blurry Photos, which is a podcast that explores the unexplained and explains the unexplored. I delve really deeply into topics of mysteries and history, paranormal subjects, cryptids and monsters, folklore, conspiracies, UFOs, all kinds of stuff. Tried to get to the truth behind them, the fact behind the fiction, as it were, and it's a really good time. I've been around since 2012, so going on 7 years now, and I have a lot of fun doing it. And DB has been on before on Blurry Photos. He's been on Bullstone, which was a news segment, supplemental type thing to the show, and had a lot of fun.
Oh yeah, I think I talked about astronauts peeing on tires for some reason.
That and the graves that had the video of people and stuff.
Oh yeah. Yeah, that was fun.
Yeah, so that's Blurry Photos. That's what I do.
Yeah, where's besides blurryphotos.org, where are you at?
If you search Blurry Photos podcast, pretty much anywhere, I'll pop up. Twitter, I am blurry_photos, and then like Facebook and Instagram, Blurry Photos podcast. That's pretty much the how you get to me.
All right. Well, now that everyone's done fast forwarding through us talking, we're going to be talking about some Ambrose Bierce this episode. We've got Ken Hite at the end of this, and we're going to be reading some stories.
And this is the second part, hopefully.
Oh yeah.
Of our foray into Bierce. The first one being on my feed over at Blurry Photos.
And the second part being over here at Black Clock Audio Tales. And we're going to be reading One of the Missing, and also be reading The Mockingbird. So, and if you want to hear Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge and The Damned Thing, check out Blurry Photos, because they're going to have it. Hopefully.
That's where it's going to be.
Yeah.
We're going to do the damn thing. You're literally going to do the damn thing.
It was an occurrence at the Owl Creek. It was an occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge. The damn thing.
Yeah, the damn thing.
All right, so let's get going on The Mockingbird.
The time, a pleasant Sunday afternoon in the early autumn of 1861. The place, a forest heart in the mountain region of southwestern Virginia. Private Grayrock of the Federal Army is discovered seated comfortably at the root of a great pine tree, against which he leans, his legs extended straight along the ground, his rifle lying across his thighs, his hands, clasped in order that they may not fall away to his sides, resting upon the barrel of the weapon. The contact of the back of his head with the tree has pushed his cap downward over his eyes, almost concealing them. One seeing him would say that he slept. Private Grayrock did not sleep. To have done so would have imperiled the interests of the United States, for he was a long way outside the lines and subject to capture or death at the hands of the enemy. Moreover, he was in a frame of mind unfavorable to repose. The cause of his perturbation of spirit was this. During the previous night he had served on the picket guard, and had been posted as a sentinel in this very forest. The night was clear, though moonless, but in the gloom of the wood the darkness was deep. Grayrock's post was at a considerable distance from those to right and left, for the pickets had been thrown out a needless distance from the camp, making the line too long for the force detailed to occupy it. The war was young, and military camp entertained the error that while sleeping they were better protected by thin lines a long way out toward the enemy than by thicker ones close in, and surely they needed as long notice as possible of an enemy's approach, for they were at the time addicted to the practice of undressing, than which nothing could be more unsoldierly. On the morning of the memorable 6th of April, at Shiloh, many of Grant's men, when spitted on Confederate bayonets, were as naked as civilians, but it should be allowed that this was not because of any defect in their picket line. Their error was of another sort. They had no pickets. This is perhaps a vain digression. I should not care to undertake the interest. The reader in the fate of an army. What we have here to consider is that of Private Grayrock. For 2 hours after he had been left at his lonely post that Saturday night, he stood stock still, leaning against the trunk of a large tree, staring into the darkness in his front, and trying to recognize known objects, for he had been posted at the same spot during the day. But all was now different. He saw nothing in detail, but only groups of things whose shapes not observed, when there was something more of them to observe, were now unfamiliar. They seemed not to have been there before. A landscape that is all trees and undergrowth, moreover, lacks definition, is confused and without accentuated points upon which attention can gain a foothold. Add the gloom of a moonless night, and something more than great natural intelligence, and a city education is required to preserve one's knowledge of direction. And that is how it occurred that Private Greyrock, after vigilantly watching the spaces in his front, and then imprudently executing a circumspection of his whole dimly visible environment, silently walking around his tree to accomplish it, lost his bearings and seriously impaired his usefulness as a sentinel. Lost at his post, unable to stay in which direction to look for an enemy's approach, and in which lay the sleeping camp, for whose security he was accountable with his life, conscious, too, of many other awkward features of the situation and of considerations affecting his own safety. Private Greyrock was profoundly disquieted, nor was he given time to recover his tranquility, for almost at the moment that he realized his awkward predicament, he heard a stir of leaves and a snap of fallen twigs, and turning with a stilled heart in the direction whence it came, saw in the gloom the indistinct outlines of a human figure. "Halt!" shouted Private Greyrock, peremptorily as in duty bound, backing up the command with the sharp metallic snap of his cocking rifle. "Who goes there?" There was no answer. At least there was an instant's hesitation, and the answer, if it came, was lost in a report of a sentinel's rifle. In the silence of the night, and the forest sound was deafening, and hardly had it died away when it was repeated by the pieces of the pickets to the right and left, a sympathetic fusillade. For 2 hours every unconverted civilian of them had been evolving enemies from his imagination, and peopling the woods in his front with them, and Greyrock's shot had started the whole encroaching host into visible existence. Having fired, all retreated breathless to the reserves, all but Greyrock, who did not know in what direction to retreat, when no enemy appearing, the roused camp 2 miles away had undressed and got itself into bed again, and the pocket line was cautiously re-established. He was discovered bravely holding his ground, and was complimented by the officer of the guard as the one soldier of that devoted band who could rightly be considered the moral equivalent of that uncommon unit of value, a whoop in hell. In the meantime, however, Greyrock had made a close but unavailing search for the mortal part of the intruder, at whom he had fired, and whom he had marked man's intuitive sense of having hit, for he was one of those born experts who shoot without aim by an instinctive sense of direction, and are nearly as dangerous by night as by day. During a full half of his 24 years, he had been a terror to the targets of all the shooting galleries in 3 cities. Unable now to produce his dead game, he had the discretion to hold his tongue, and was glad to observe in his offering comrades the natural assumption that, not having run away, he had seen nothing hostile. His honorable mention had been earned by not running away anyhow. Nevertheless, Private Greyrock was far from satisfied with the night's adventure, and when the next day he made some fair enough pretext to apply for a pass to go outside the lines, and the general commanding promptly granted it in recognition of his bravery, the night before he passed out at the point where that had been displayed, telling the sentinel then on duty there that he had lost something, which was true enough. He renewed the search for the person whom he supposed himself to have a shot, and whom, if only wounded, he hoped to trail by the blood. He was no more successful by daylight than he had been in the darkness, and after covering a wide area and boldly penetrating a long distance into the Confederacy, he gave up the search, somewhat fatigued, seated himself at the root of the great pine tree, where we have seen him, and indulged his disappointment. It is not to be inferred that Greyrock's was the charging of a cruel nature, balked of his bloody deed. In the clear large eyes, finely wrought lips, and broad forehead of that young man one could read quite another story, and in point of fact his character was a singularly fallacious compound of boldness and sensibility, courage and conscience. I find myself disappointed, he said to himself, sitting there at the bottom of the golden haze, submerging the forest like a subtler sea. Disappointed in failing to discover a fellow man dead by my hand. Do I then really wish that I had taken life in the performance of a duty as well as performed without? What more could I wish? If any danger threatened, my shot averted it. That is what I was there to do. No, I am glad indeed, if no human life was needlessly extinguished by me. But I am in a false position. I have suffered myself to be complimented by my officers, and envied by my comrades. The camp is ringing with praise of my courage. That is not just. I know myself courageous, but this praise is for specific acts which I did not perform, or performed otherwise. It is believed that I remained at my post bravely, without firing, whereas it was I who began the fusillade, and I did not retreat in the general alarm because bewildered. What then shall I do? Explain that I saw an enemy and fired? They have all said that of themselves, yet none believes it. Shall I tell a truth which, discrediting my courage, will I have the effect of a lie? It is an ugly business altogether. I wish to God I could find my man. And so wishing, Private Greyrock, overcome at last by a languor of the afternoon, and lulled by the stilly sounds of insects, droning and prosing, in certain fragrant shrubs, so far forgot the interests of the United States as to fall asleep and expose himself to capture, and sleeping he dreamed. He thought himself a boy living in a far, fair land by the border of a great river upon which the tall steamboats moved grandly up and down beneath their towering evolutions of black smoke, which announced them long before they had rounded the bends and marked their movements when miles out of sight. With them always, as his side as he watched them, was one to whom he gave his heart and soul in love, a twin brother. Together they strolled along the banks of the stream, together explored the fields lying farther away from it, and gathered pungent mints and sticks of fragrant sassafras in the hills overlooking all, beyond which lay the realm of conjecture, and from which, looking southward across the great river, they caught glimpses of the enchanted land. Hand in hand, the heart in heart, they two, the only children of a widowed mother, walked in paths of light through valleys of peace, seeing new things under a new sun, and though all the golden days floated once unseasoned sound, the rich, thrilling melody of a mockingbird in a cage by the cottage door, it pervaded and possessed all the spiritual intervals of the dream, like a musical benediction. The joyous bird was always in song. Its infinitely various notes seemed to flow from its throat, effortless, in bubbles and rills at each heartbeat, like the waters of a pulsing spring. That fresh, clear melody seemed, indeed, the spirit of the scene, the meaning and interpretation, the sense of the mysteries of life and love. But there came a time when the days of the dream grew dark with sorrow. In a rain of tears, the good mother was dead. The meadowside home was the great river was broken up, and the brothers were parted between two of their kinsmen. William, the dreamer, went to live in a populous city in the realm of conjecture, and John, crossing the river into the enchanted land, was taken into a distant region, whose people and their lives and ways were said to be strange and wicked. To him, in the distribution of the dead mother's estate, had fallen all that they deemed of value. The mockingbird. They could be divided, but it could not, so it was carried away into the strange country, and the world of William knew it no more forever. Yet still through the aftertime of his loneliness its song filled all the dream, and seemed always sounding in his ear and in his heart. The kinsmen who had adopted the boys were enemies, holding no communication, for a time letters full of boyish bravado and boastful narratives of the new and larger experience, grotesque descriptions of their widening lives and the new worlds they had conquered, passed between them, but these gradually became less frequent, and with William's removal to another and greater city seas altogether, but ever though it all ran the song of a mockingbird, and when the dreamer opened his eyes and stared through the vistas of the pine forest, the cessation of the music first apprised him that he was awake. The sun was low and red in the west. The level rays projected from the trunk of each giant pine a wall of shadow traversing the golden haze to eastward until light and shade were blended in undistinguishable blue. Private Greyrock rose to his feet, looked cautiously about him, shouldered his rifle, and set off toward camp. He had gone perhaps a half-mile, and was passing a thicket of laurel, when a bird rose the mist of it, and perching on the branch of a tree above, poured from its joyous breast so inexhaustible floods of song, as but one of all God's creatures can utter in his praise. There was little in that. It was only to open the bill and breathe. Yet the man stopped, as if struck, stopped, and let fall his rifle, looked upward at the bird, covered his eyes with the hands, and wept like a child. For the moment he was indeed a child, in spirit and in memory, dwelling again by the great river, over against the enchanted land. Then with an effort of the will, he pulled himself together, picked up his weapon, and audibly damning himself, for an idiot strode on, passing an opening that reached into the heart of the little thicket. He looked in, and there supine upon the earth, its arms all abroad, its gray uniform stained with a single spot of blood upon the breast, its white face turned sharply upward and backward, lay the image of himself, the body of John Greyrock, dead of a gunshot wound, and still warm. He had found his man. As the unfortunate soldier knelt beside that masterwork of civil war, the shrilling bird upon the bough overhead stilled her song, and flushed with sunset's crimson glory, glided silently away through the solemn spaces of the wood. At roll call that evening in the federal camp, the name William Greyrock brought no response, nor ever again thereafter. End of The Mockingbird by Ambrose Bierce, read by Chris Caron.
Thanks again to Chris for reading that for us, and if you want to be on the show and read something for us, why not check out pgttcm.com and check out Black Clock Audio Tales, how to be on the podcast, contact us, or any of those cool things. Track us down on Twitter, Facebook. I'm really easy to get get in touch with if you want to read for the show. And check out our schedule and see what we've got coming up. Maybe there's something you want to read, one of your favorite stories, short poems, bits of folklore, whatever. All right, well, back to the show.
War is hell.
Oh, yeah.
What do you think about this one?
I personally feel like it's a good story. It's like I don't know, Chekhov's brother. As soon as like the brother's mentioned, you kind of feel like, oh well,
he's gonna have to be used in the third act.
Yeah, and it's like, yeah. It also feels like very much kind of like Bierce was definitely thinking about how the Civil War was definitely of conflict of brother against brother, and kind of damned if you do, kind of damned if you don't element to it, about like, even if he does shoot other people, he's still shooting people who used to be Americans.
Yeah. It's the ultimate conundrum, I guess.
Yeah.
I mean, that one's like between a rock and a hard place, and then a immovable object and the Hulk. Like it's he had no good options.
No, not
He could
really.
have just run.
Yeah.
But then like, deserters, they didn't fare well either.
Or you could get attacked by some damn thing in the wild oats.
That's right. Yeah. Run away, get attacked by some damn thing, or get hung.
Yep.
Get hanged.
It's crazy stuff. I mean, yeah, no, there's definitely things about this that really remind me of a lot of Ambrose Bierce. Just the twist ending, the travel log of how beautiful the landscape is, and I kind of get the feeling that Ambrose Bierce just kind of wishes, like, I'm just glad Ambrose Bierce wasn't a Bond supervillain, because he'd be like, my plan is to wipe the earth clean. But you'll die too.
Yeah.
I don't care.
Yeah.
I'm bitter
but
Bierce.
the earth-
And we have one of the missing now. There's no way there's anything with family or a twist ending in this one, so hold on to your hats.
One of the missing. Jerome Searing, a private soldier of General Sherman's army, then confronting the enemy at and about Kennesaw Mountain, Georgia, turned his back upon a small group of officers with whom he'd been talking in low tones, stepped across a light line of earthworks, and disappeared in a forest. None of the men in line behind the works had said a word to him, nor had he so much as nodded to them in passing, but all who saw understood that this brave man had been entrusted with some perilous duty. Jerome Searing, though a private, did not serve in the ranks. He was detailed for service at division headquarters, being borne upon the rolls as an orderly. Orderly is a word covering a multitude of duties. An orderly may be a messenger, a clerk, an officer servant, anything. He may perform services for which no provision is made in orders and army regulations. Their nature may depend on his aptitude, upon favor, upon accident. Private Searing, an incomparable marksman, young, hardy, intelligent, and insensible to fear, was a scout. The general commanding his division was not content to obey orders blindly without knowing what was in his front, even when his command was not on detached service, but formed a fraction of the line of the army. Nor was he satisfied to receive his knowledge of his vis-a-vis through the customary channels. He wanted to know more than he was apprised of by the corps commander and the collisions of pickets and skirmishers. Hence, Jerome Searing, with his extraordinary daring, his woodcraft, his sharp eyes, and truthful tongue. On this occasion, his instructions were simple: to get as near the enemy's lines as possible and learn all that he could. In a few moments, he had arrived at the picket line, the men on duty there lying in groups of 2 and 4 behind little banks of earth scooped out of the slight depression in which they lay, their rifles protruding from the green boughs with which they had masked their small defenses. The forest extended without a break toward the front, so solemn and silent that only by an effort of the imagination could it be conceived as populous with armed men, alert and vigilant. A forest formidable with possibilities of battle. Pausing a moment in one of these rifle pits to apprise the men of his intention, Searing crept stealthily forward on his hands and knees, and was soon lost to view in a dense thicket of underbrush. "That's the last of him," said one of the men. "Wish I had his rifle. Those fellows will hurt some of us with it." Searing crept on, taking advantage of every accident of ground and growth to give himself better cover. His eyes penetrated everywhere. His ears took note of every sound. He stilled his breathing, and at the cracking of a twig beneath his knee stopped his progress and hugged the earth. It was slow work, but not tedious. The danger made it exciting, but by no physical signs was the excitement manifest. His pulse was as regular, his nerves were as steady as if he were trying to trap a sparrow. "Seems a long time," he thought, "but I cannot have come very far. I'm still alive." He smiled at his own method of estimating distance and crept forward. A moment later, he suddenly flattened himself upon the earth and lay motionless, minute after minute. Through a narrow opening in the bushes, he'd caught sight of a small mound of yellow clay, one of the enemy's rifle pits. After some little time, he cautiously raised his head, inch by inch, then his body upon his hands, spread out on each side of him, all the while intently regarding the hillock of clay. In another moment, he was upon his feet, rifle in hand, striding rapidly forward with little attempt at concealment. He had rightly interpreted the signs, whatever they were. The enemy was gone. To assure himself beyond a doubt before going back to report upon so important a matter, Searing pushed forward across the line of abandoned pits, running from cover to cover in the more open forest, his eyes vigilant to discover possible stragglers. He came to the edge of a plantation, one of those forlorn, deserted homesteads of the last years of the war, upgrown with brambles, ugly with broken fences, and desolate with vacant buildings having blank apertures in place of doors and windows. After a keen reconnaissance from the safe seclusion of a clump of young pines, Searing ran lightly across a field and through an orchard to a small structure which stood apart from the other farm buildings on a slight elevation. This, he thought, would enable him to overlook a large scope of the country in the direction that he supposed the enemy to have taken in withdrawing. This building, which had originally consisted of a single room elevated upon 4 posts about 10 feet high, was now little more than a roof. The floor had fallen away, the joists and planks loosely piled on the ground below or resting on end at various angles, not wholly torn from their fastenings above. The supporting posts were themselves no longer vertical. It looked as if the whole edifice would go down at the touch of a finger. Concealing himself from the debris of joists and flooring, Searing looked across the open ground between his point of view and a spur of the Kennesaw Mountain. A half-mile away, a road leading up and across the spur was crowded with troops, the rear guard of the retiring enemy, their gun barrels gleaming in the morning sunlight. Searing had now learned all that he could hope to know. It was his duty to return to his own command with all possible speed and report his discovery. But the gray column of Confederates toiling up the mountain road was singularly tempting. His rifle, an ordinary Springfield, but fitted with a globe sight and hair trigger, would easily send its 1.25 ounces of lead hissing into their midst. That would probably not affect the duration and result of the war, but it's the business of a soldier to kill. It is also his habit if he is a good soldier. Searing cocked his rifle and set the trigger. But it was decreed from the beginning of time that Private Searing was not to murder anybody that bright summer morning, nor was the Confederate retreat to be announced by him. For countless ages, events had been so matching themselves together in that wondrous mosaic to some parts of which, dimly discernible, we give the name of history, that the acts which he had in will would have marred the harmony of the pattern. Some 25 years previously, the power charged with the execution of the work according to the design had provided against that mischance by causing the birth of a certain male child in a little village at the foot of the Carpathian Mountains, had carefully reared it, supervised its education, directed its desires into a military channel, and in due time made it an officer of artillery. By the concurrence of an infinite number of favoring influences and their preponderance over an infinite number of opposing ones, this officer of artillery had been made to commit a breach of discipline and flee from his native country to avoid punishment. He had been directed to New Orleans instead of New York, where a recruiting officer awaited him on the wharf. He was enlisted and promoted, and things were so ordered that he now commanded a Confederate battery some 2 miles along the line from where Jerome Searing, the Federal scout, stood cocking his rifle. Nothing had been neglected. At every step in the progress of both these men's lives, and then the lives of their contemporaries and ancestors, and then the lives of the contemporaries of their ancestors, the right thing had been done to bring about the desired result. Had anything in all this vast concatenation been overlooked, Private Searing might have fired on the retreating Confederates that morning, and would perhaps have missed. As it fell out, a Confederate captain of artillery, having nothing better to do while awaiting his turn to pull out and be off, amused himself by sighting a field piece obliquely to his right at what he mistook for some federal officers on the crest of a hill and discharged it. The shot flew high of its mark. As Jerome Searing drew back the hammer of his rifle and with his eyes upon the distant Confederates considered where he could plant his shot with the best hope of making a widow or an orphan or a childless mother, perhaps all three, for Private Searing, although he had repeatedly refused promotion, was not without a certain kind of ambition, he heard a rushing sound in the air, like that made by the wings of a great bird swooping down upon its prey. More quickly than he could apprehend the gradation, it increased to a hoarse and horrible roar, as the missile that made it sprang at him out of the sky, striking with a deafening impact one of the posts supporting the confusion of timbers above him, smashing it into matchwood, and bringing down the crazy edifice with a loud clatter in clouds of blinding dust. When Jerome Searing recovered consciousness, he did not at once understand what had occurred. It was, indeed, some time before he opened his eyes. For a while, he believed that he had died and been buried, and he tried to recall some portions of the burial service. He thought that his wife was kneeling upon his grave, adding her weight to that of the earth upon his breast. The two of them, widow and earth, had crushed his coffin. Unless the children should persuade her to go home, he would not much longer be able to breathe. He felt a sense of wrong. I cannot speak to her, he thought. The dead have no voice, and if I open my eyes, I shall get them full of earth. He opened his eyes. A great expanse of blue sky, rising from a fringe of the tops of trees. In the foreground, shutting out some of the trees, a high dun mound, angular in outline and crossed by an intricate, patternless system of straight lines. The whole an immeasurable distance away. A distance so inconceivably great that it fatigued him, and he closed his eyes. The moment that he did so, he was conscious of an insufferable light. A sound was in his ears like the low, rhythmic thunder of a distant sea breaking in successive waves upon the beach, and out of this noise, seeming a part of it, or possibly coming from beyond it, and intermingled with its ceaseless undertone, came the articulate words, "Jerome Searing, you are caught like a rat in a trap. In a trap, trap, trap." Suddenly, there fell a great silence, a black darkness, an infinite tranquility, and Jerome Searing, perfectly conscious of his rathood, and well assured of the trap that he was in, remembering all and nowise alarmed, again opened his eyes to reconnoiter, to note the strength of his enemy, to plan his defense. He was caught in a reclining posture, his back firmly supported by a solid beam. Another lay across his breast, but he had been able to shrink a little away from it so that it no longer oppressed him, though it was immovable. A brace joining it at an angle had wedged him against a pile of boards on his left, fastening the arm on that side. His legs, slightly parted and straight along the ground, were covered upward to the knees with a mass of debris which towered above his narrow horizon. His head was as rigidly fixed as in a vice. He could move his eyes, his chin, no more. Only his right arm was partly free. "You must help us out of this," he said to it, but he could not get it from under the heavy timber athwart his chest, nor move it outward more than 6 inches at the elbow. Searing was not seriously injured, nor did he suffer pain. A smart rap on the head from a flying fragment of the splintered post, incurred simultaneously with the frightfully sudden shock to the nervous system, had momentarily dazed him. His term of unconsciousness, including the period of recovery during which he had the strange fancies, had probably not exceeded a few seconds, for the dust of the wreck had not wholly cleared away as he began an intelligent survey of the situation. With his partly free right hand, he now tried to get hold of the beam that lay across, but not quite against, his breast. In no way could he do so. He was unable to depress the shoulder so as to push the elbow beyond that edge of the timber which was nearest his knees. Failing in that, he could not raise the forearm and hand to grasp the beam. The brace that made an angle with it downward and backward prevented him from doing anything in that direction, and between it and his body, the space was not half so wide as the length of his forearm. Obviously, he could not get his hand under the beam nor over it. The hand could not, in fact, touch it at all. Having demonstrated his inability, he desisted and began to think whether he could reach any of the debris piled upon his legs. In surveying the mass with a view to determining that point, his attention was arrested by what seemed to be a ring of shining metal immediately in front of his eyes. It appeared to him at first to surround some perfectly black substance, and it was somewhat more than a half-inch in diameter. Suddenly occurred to his mind that the blackness was simply shadow, and that the ring was in fact the muzzle of his rifle protruding from the pile of debris. He was not long in satisfying himself that this was so, if it was satisfaction. By closing either eye, he could look a little way along the barrel, to the point where it was hidden by the rubbish that held it. He could see the one side with the corresponding eye, at apparently the same angle as the other side with the other eye. Looking with the right eye, the weapon seemed to be directed at a point to the left of his head, and vice versa. He was unable to see the upper surface of the barrel, but he could see the undersurface of the stock at a slight angle. The piece was, in fact, aimed at the exact center of his forehead. In the perception of this circumstance, in the recollection that, just previously to the mischance of which this uncomfortable situation was the result, he had cocked the rifle and set the trigger so that a touch would discharge it, Private Searing was affected with a feeling of uneasiness, but that was as far as possible from fear. He was a brave man, what familiar with the aspect of rifles from that point of view, and of cannon too, and now he recalled, with something like amusement, an incident of his experience at the storming of Missionary Ridge, where, walking up to one of the enemy's embrasures from which he had seen a heavy gun throw charge after charge of grape among the assailants, he had thought for a moment that the piece had been withdrawn. He could see nothing in the opening but a brazen circle. What that was, he had understood just in time to step aside as it pitched another peck of iron down that swarming slope. To face firearms is one of the commonest incidents in a soldier's life. Firearms, too, with malevolent eyes blazing behind them. That is what a soldier is for. Still, Private Searing did not altogether relish the situation, and turned away his eyes. After groping, aimless, with his right hand for a time, he made an ineffectual attempt to release his left. Then he tried to disengage his head, the fixity of which was the more annoying from his ignorance of what held it. Next, he tried to free his feet, but while exerting the powerful muscles of his legs for that purpose, it occurred to him that a disturbance of the rubbish which held them might discharge the rifle. How it could have endured what had already befallen he could not understand, although memory assisted him with several instances in point. One in particular he recalled, in which a moment of mental abstraction he had clubbed his rifle and beaten out another gentleman's brains, observing afterwards that the weapon which he had been diligently swinging by the muzzle was loaded, capped, and at full cock, knowledge of which circumstance would doubtless have cheered his antagonist to longer endurance. He had always smiled in recalling that blunder of his green and salad days as a soldier, but now he did not smile. He turned his eyes again to the muzzle of the rifle, and for a moment fancied that it had moved. It seemed somewhat nearer. Again he looked away. The tops of the distant trees beyond the bounds of the plantation interested him. He had not before observed how light and feathery they were, nor how darkly blue the sky was, even among their branches, where they somewhat paled it with their green. Above him, it appeared almost black. It'll be uncomfortably hot here, he thought, as the day advances. Wonder which way I'm looking. Judging by such shadows as he could see, he decided that his face was due north. He would at least not have the sun in his eyes, and north, well, that was towards his wife and children. Bah, he exclaimed aloud. What have they to do with it? He closed his eyes. As I can't get out, I may as well go to sleep. The rebels are gone, and some of our fellows are sure to stray out here foraging. They'll find me. But he did not sleep. Gradually, he became sensible of a pain in his forehead. A dull ache, hardly perceptible at first, but growing more and more uncomfortable. He opened his eyes, and it was gone. Closed them, and it returned. "The devil," he said irreverently, and stared again at the sky. He heard the singing of birds, the strange metallic note of the meadowlark, suggesting the clash of vibrant blades. He fell into pleasant memories of his childhood, played again with his brother and sister, raced across the fields, shouting to alarm the sedentary larks, entered the somber forest beyond, and with timid steps followed the faint path to Ghost Rock, standing at last with audible heart-throbs before the dead man's cave and seeking to penetrate its awful mystery. For the first time, he observed that the opening of the haunted cavern was encircled by a ring of metal. Then all else vanished and left him gazing into the barrel of his rifle as before. But whereas before it had seemed nearer, it now seemed an inconceivable distance away, and all the more sinister for that. He cried out, and startled by something in his own voice, the note of fear, lied to himself in denial. "If I don't sing out, I may stay here until I die." He made no further attempt to evade the menacing stare of the gun barrel. If he turned away his eyes an instant, it was to look for assistance, although he could not see the ground on either side of the ruin, and he permitted them to return, obedient to the imperative fascination. If he closed them, it was from weariness, and instantly the poignant pain in his forehead, the prophecy and menace of the bullet, forced him to reopen them. The tension of nerve and brain was too severe. Nature came to his relief with intervals of unconsciousness. Reviving from one of these, he became sensible of a sharp, smarting pain in his right hand, and when he worked his fingers together or rubbed his palm with them, he could feel they were wet and slippery. He could not see the hand, but he knew the sensation. It was running blood. In his delirium, he had beaten it against the jagged fragments of the wreck, had clutched it full of splinters. He resolved that he would meet his fate more manly. He was a plain, common soldier, had no religion and not much philosophy. He could not die like a hero with great and wise last words, even if there had been someone to hear them. But he could die game, and he would. But if he could only know when to expect the shot. Some rats, which had probably inhabited the shed, came sneaking and scampering about. One of them mounted the pile of debris that held the rifle. Another followed, and another. Searing regarded them at first with indifference, then with friendly interest. Then, as a thought flashed into his bewildered mind that they might touch the trigger of his rifle, he cursed them and ordered them to go away. "It's no business of yours," he cried. The creatures went away. They would return later, attack his face, gnaw away his nose, cut his throat, he knew that. But he hoped by that time to be dead. Nothing could now unfix his gaze from the little ring of metal with its black interior. The pain in his forehead was fierce and incessant. He felt it gradually penetrating the brain more and more deeply, until at last its progress was arrested by the wood at the back of his head. It grew momentarily more insufferable. He began wantonly beating his lacerated hand against the splinters again to counteract that horrible ache. It seemed to throb with a slow, regular recurrence, each pulsation sharper than the preceding, and sometimes he cried out, thinking he felt the fatal bullet. No thoughts of home, of wife and children, of country, of glory. The whole record of memory was effaced. The world had passed away. Not a vestige remained. Here in this confusion of timbers and boards is the sole universe. Here is immortality in time, each pain an everlasting life. The throbs tick off eternities. Jerome Searing, The man of courage, the formidable enemy, the strong, resolute warrior, was as pale as a ghost. His jaw was fallen, his eyes protruded. He trembled in every fiber. A cold sweat bathed his entire body. He screamed with fear. He was not insane. He was terrified. In groping about with his torn and bleeding hand, he seized at last a strip of board, and pulling, felt it give way. It lay parallel with his body, and by bending his elbow as much as the contracted space would permit, he could draw it a few inches at a time. Finally, it was altogether loosened from the wreckage covering his legs. He could lift it clear of the ground its whole length. A great hope came into his mind. Perhaps he could work it upward, that is to say backward, far enough to lift the end and push aside the rifle. Or if that were too tightly wedged, so place the strip of board as to deflect the bullet. With this object, he passed it backward inch by inch, hardly daring to breathe lest the act somehow defeat his intent, and more than ever unable to remove his eyes from the rifle, which might perhaps now hasten to improve its waning opportunity. Something at least had been gained. In the occupation of his mind, in this attempt at self-defense, he was less sensible of the pain in his head, and had ceased to wince. But he was still dreadfully frightened, and his teeth rattled like castanets. The strip of board ceased to move to the suasion of his hand. He tugged at it with all his strength, changed the direction of its length all he could, but it had met some extended obstruction behind him, and the end in front was still too far away to clear the pile of debris and reach the muzzle of the gun. It extended, indeed, nearly as far as the trigger guard, which, uncovered by the rubbish, he could imperfectly see with his right eye. He tried to break the strip with his hand, but had no leverage. In his defeat, all his terror returned, augmented tenfold. The black aperture of the rifle appeared to threaten a sharper and more imminent death and punishment of his rebellion. The track of the bullet through his head ached with an intenser anguish. He began to tremble again. Suddenly he became composed. His tremor subsided. He clenched his teeth and drew down his eyebrows. He had not exhausted his means of defense. A new design had shaped itself in his mind, another plan of battle. Raising the front end of the strip of board, he carefully pushed it forward through the wreckage at the side of the rifle until it pressed against the trigger guard. Then he moved the end slowly outward until he could feel that it had cleared it. Then, closing his eyes, thrust it against the trigger with all his strength. There was no explosion. The rifle had been discharged as it dropped from his hand when the building fell, but it did its work. Lieutenant Adrian Searing, in command of the picket guard on that part of the line through which his brother Jerome had passed on his mission, sat with attentive ears in his breastwork behind the line. Not the faintest sound escaped him. The cry of a bird, the barking of a squirrel, the noise of the wind among the pines, all were anxiously noted by his overstrained sense. Suddenly, directly in front of his line, he heard a faint, confused rumble, like the clatter of a falling building translated by distance. The lieutenant mechanically looked at his watch. 6 o'clock and 18 minutes. At the same moment, an officer approached him on foot from the rear and saluted. "Lieutenant," said the officer, "Colonel directs you to move forward your line and feel the enemy if you find him. If not, continue the advance until directed to halt. There's no reason to think that the enemy has retreated." The lieutenant nodded and said nothing. The other officer retired. In a moment, the men, apprised of their duty by the non-commissioned officers in low tones, had deployed from their rifle pits and were moving forward in skirmishing order, with set teeth and beating hearts. This line of skirmishers sweeps across the plantation toward the mountain. They pass on both sides of the wrecked building, observing nothing. At a short distance in their rear, their commander comes. He casts his eyes curiously upon the ruin and sees a dead body half buried in boards and timbers. It is so covered with dust that its clothing is Confederate gray. Its face is yellowish white. The cheeks are fallen in, the temples sunken too, with sharp ridges about them, making the forehead forbiddingly narrow. The upper lip, slightly lifted, shows the white teeth, rigidly clenched. The hair is heavy with moisture, the face as wet as the dewy grass all about. From his point of view, the officer does not observe the rifle. The man was apparently killed by the falling of the building. "Dead a week," said the officer curtly, moving on and absently pulling out his watch, as if to verify his estimate of time. 6:40.
I'm glad we end on a beat note.
Yeah, no, it's such. Yeah, no. There's really no happy endings with Ambrose Bierce. I don't know if you know this or not, but no one knows when he died.
With how bitter he sounds about stuff too, like I wonder if it would be beyond reasonable to think that he maybe just kind of snuck off, to go live quietly somewhere away from everybody.
Got dysentery or just sick or something and just died. No one's found his body ever. I mean, he has a tombstone, but there's nothing in it. It's
Wow.
kind of a, I don't know, kind of a Biercean ending almost in some ways. Oh hey, here's me with Ken Hite.
Let's talk Ambrose. What's going on?
Well, okay, so I'll be super honest about my knowledge of literature. Ambrose Bierce is one of those that is like Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge was something that we were forced to read, and then on top of that, like my dad making me read like Civil War stories. Like, here's a collection of Civil War stories. Read up. I want a 3-page report in 2 days. And anyway, I mean, that's like, I feel like I kind of have an idea of who this Ambrose Bierce guy is. He's a Civil War guy who then went on to write for various folks over in San Francisco after the war, and short story guy, and mostly known for twist endings and stuff. Who is this Ambrose Bierce guy?
Who is this Ambrose Bierce guy? I mean, that's pretty much it, right? I mean, you have the high points.
Okay.
Very much informed by his Civil War experiences. He volunteered, served ably, was promoted to a lieutenant, went through Shiloh, went through other battles. The Shiloh is probably the worst one, and he's got a memoir called What I Saw at Shiloh, that is, or What I Saw of Shiloh, I'm sorry, I got the title wrong, that is sort of... it's almost, what do I want to say? It's like this sort of stochastic flash narrative. It's like sort of Joycean almost, except it's short and readable, and it's quite a thing. And it's, I assume, and having never been in combat myself, but people who have been in combat basically say, "Yep, that's what it's like. You have no idea what's going on. It's this series of incredibly intense with you forever. But as far as making any sense of it at the time or later, good luck." And so that's the, and that's really where he gets a sense of human life and human worth and human intelligence. And should he have kept any fragment of optimism coming out of the Battle of Shiloh, he then covered politics, state politics and national politics for 30 years, and that pretty much put the end to it. And so I guess the other thing that everyone knows about Ambrose Bierce is the Devil's Dictionary, which is a series of mordant observations about life disguised as a dictionary. So, for example, a cynic is a person who insists on seeing things as they actually are instead of as he wishes them to be. And so that's a Devil's Dictionary definition. And that's, it seems sort of facile to sort of boil him down to the notion that Ambrose Bierce is all cynicism and pessimism and nihilism even. But that seems to be what Ambrose Bierce wanted you to boil him down to. If he wanted you to sort of look at a second side of him as a doting family man or a happy-go-lucky scamp, he crushed every impulse of that in his writing. He's got a sort of I don't want to say cruel, but certainly a satirical, biting sense of humor. But that's not the same thing as having a happy side. And maybe he was a devotee, I guess, of Poe's notion of the unified artistic effect. So happiness is not part of the effect he's going for. He's going for the effect of trauma and horror, really, right?
Yeah, no, definitely. And he definitely achieves horror. But do writings like his still matter? I mean, is this something that, like, his stories all seem kind of formulaic, and it's like, if you've read a couple of them, it seems almost like telegraphed in what's going to happen at the end. But like, does this matter? Is it something like, should people continue to read Bierce, or is this kind of like almost like I don't know, like kind of like an archaic form that we should just kind of like move on to bigger and better things?
I mean, it's hard for me to say that, a certain piece of art that was valuable at its time is now not valuable. It's, in theory, still speaks to the same impulse and the same recognition, or else it wasn't art in the first place. It was journalism, and Bierce would have been the first guy to say that. But I mean, like anybody who had a 30-year career as a writer, although his short story career is much shorter than that, it's about 15 years. He has his ups and his downs. But I defy anyone to read Chickamauga now or in 1890 without recoiling in exactly the same horror. I mean, that story is perfect, and it's perfectly awful, and it's as relevant now as it ever was. And the trick ending is just the recognition of the horror. It's not O. Henry, right? Or even the trick ending in Owl Creek Bridge, which I guess we're not really saying spoilers because, again, 100-year-old story. But just a note to people, might want to read the stories before we go into this. But yeah, I mean, you're right. The sort of the heavy-handed irony is part and parcel of what he does. So, for example, there's the guy in the Leap at Coulter's Notch, I think is what it is, where he has to shoot the horseman, and the horseman is his father. And so the guy who in the story that you talked about in The Mockingbird, he shoots a guy and it's his twin brother. And it's like, well, yeah, okay, we get it. Bierce, brother. But families are torn apart. It's a civil war. It's right there in the name. But on the other hand, the stories are not so long that you're angry that you wasted time. I mean, they take 5 minutes to read? Yeah. And so you're not missing anything, and what you are getting is an example of how to write to a unified effect. And that's something, again, that's part of why they teach it, like you were saying, in high school, is because it is very, very clear and very, very unadorned and very much about one thing that is obvious. And is that bad? I mean, if you're reading a comic book, you know how that's going to come out. If you're watching a movie, you know how that's going to come out. Knowing the ending is not the death of literature. I mean, otherwise we could never watch a Shakespeare play twice. Oh, Othello kills her. I've seen it. I don't need to see it. I mean, that's how tragedy works in a way.
And thank you for really kind of like pointing out the difference between like art and pop culture, which
I mean, the difference is something that you can pretty much guess at the time. But in 100 years, I mean, people are reading Bierce and Lovecraft and other things that were absolutely pop culture at the time, and they're not maybe reading Theodore Dreiser as much, and he was hardcore literature. Yeah. So it's just 6 of 1, and maybe that's a little thing that we can get from Bierce is, hey, keep it short, Ted Dreiser.
One thing I did want to talk about is we cover in Black Clock Audio Tales a lot of the Cthulhu Mythos and weird fiction and stuff, and it always seems like in Lovecraft's tales of, oh goodness, I'm gonna mess up the title, supernatural horror in literature, he mentions Bierce, and there's things about like the damned thing that kind of like have influenced, I believe, The Color Out of Space, but I could totally be wrong on that one.
I mean, I think that it's an invisible monster story, and Color Out of Space is an invisible monster, and the specific notion that the damned thing is invisible because it's a color we can't see is a pretty clear tell. Yeah. Right?
Yes.
But it's just an invisible panther or something, whereas The Color Out of Space is an unknowable and invisible horror. Sure. Which I guess is why The Color Out of Space, I mean, I think The Color Out of Space works better than The Damned Thing, not least because The Damned Thing is, again, interspersed with this sort of biting satire that is absent from Color Out of Space, which is very much just about the tragedy. And then so, I mean, The Damned Thing still works. It's still great, but it's, at the end, it's an invisible panther, and you're like, okay, that's scary, but it's not, the end of everything. Yeah. But I think his link to the mythos, is having coined words that eventually Robert W. Chambers would use. And Inhabitant of Carcosa is a great little time slip story, but it's not cosmically terrifying. It's just, oh, I'm a ghost. That's the trick ending. Okay, fine, but that's not cosmic horror. Hite the Shepherd is just a fable. There's nothing in it at all that's even particularly scary, much less, cosmic. Coined the name Hastur, and so we read it into the mythos that way. I think that you can look at some of Bierce as maybe giving Lovecraft some of the tools that he used, and I think he tried them out and maybe found that he wasn't really suited to write them. Mm-hmm. Lovecraft, for all of his nihilism, he didn't have sort of a real personal stake in it. I mean, the worst thing that ever happened to Lovecraft is someone broke in and stole his clothes in New York City.
Yeah.
It's like, I mean, that's bad, but it's not the Battle of Shiloh bad. So Lovecraft's horror doesn't have that visceral reality to it, even in something like Rats in the Walls, which is a very, physically horrifying story that Bierce's does. And Bierce is just describing a wounded man. Mm-hmm. He's not even talking about, a ghoul monster. He's just saying, this guy's crawling across the field and he doesn't have a jaw. And it's like, that's awful. That's really disgusting, Ambrose. Thanks so much. But in terms of cosmicism, I mean, Bierce has got the same nihilism that Lovecraft does, but he's solely turning it on the human anthill, because to Bierce, there's no point in caring about extra cosmic worlds, because what does it matter, right? I mean, the fact is that we're trapped here in this dung heap and we're all going to die in it. So, blah. And I think that people want to read Bierce into the mythos because, first of all, everyone believes they should probably be reading Bierce, and because Lovecraft did appreciate the level of horror that Bierce could create in stories like Halpin Fraser or the toe of the left-hand foot or whatever else. But I don't think that Lovecraft is identifying Bierce as someone who's doing the cosmically weird in the way that he's doing it. And certainly he says, for example, Chambers does better with Bierce's materials than Bierce does at building a cosmic background of horror. And, since Chambers is trying that and Bierce is not, well, yep, Chambers wins. But I think that anyone who's read both Chickamauga and even The Yellow Sign, they're going to say Bierce is by far the better writer, because look at it. It's like, I recognize this as something that happens in the real world and is awful.
Oh, yeah.
And that the response is just horror or mocking laughter if you're being a jerk, which I guess Bierce sometimes was.
Yeah. Yeah. At what point does a war story stop being a war story and start being a horror story, or like vice versa? Like, it seems like due to the horrors of war, where does the separation begin and end?
The question is kind of interesting, because Bierce, of course, famously, when he does his collected works, he moves all of his supernatural stories into their own volume. Mm-hmm. So when Tales of Soldiers and Civilians comes out, there's a bunch of supernatural stories in it. Mm-hmm. And then he moves those to Can Such Things Be, when he reissues Can Such Things Be in 1908 or whenever it is. So Bierce is obviously a person who's drawing a very strong line between the supernatural and the natural in horror. But I don't know that he's drawing, if you follow me, the other line between horror and reporting that we're implying. And again, I would look at something like Chickamauga as being a absolutely non-pareil horror story, even though there's nothing supernatural in it at all. And I think your argument that the horrors of war to be conveyed unsparingly and unsentimentally, someone once said that the soldiers, the Bierce's war stories are the greatest anti-war document in American history. And he does seem to have hit upon the way to, I don't know if you're familiar with this. Sam Fuller once said that there's no such thing as an anti-war movie, because all war movies turn out to make war look super exciting. And Bierce has figured out how to beat that by, as you say, making the tragedy seem predictable in some ways. Mm-hmm. But the fact that it's predictable doesn't mean you don't still get hit in the face with a mini ball, right?
Yeah. Or have a house collapse on you.
Or have a house fall on you, or any of the other myriad awful things that happen, or have to, shell your own cabin. And again, I mean, these are arbitrary situations. The number of twin brothers that shot each other in the Civil War is probably, in the single digits. But as a symbol, as a evidence of that you've shot someone who you might have loved, or you have nothing but commonalities with, despite the fact that one of you is blue and one of you is gray, or one of you is American and one of you is German, or one of you is Chinese and one of you is Vietnamese, or whatever the pairing is, that's the true horror. The horror is that you're both young men who should be out, chasing girls and listening to mockingbirds, not sitting in a stupid ditch, right?
Yeah. Bierce is intense. Bierce is, I mean, this is just me speaking, like, off the top of my head. Bierce is so intense. I feel like some sort of relief, actually, when, okay, here's you know, we don't have Chekhov's gun, but we have Bierce's brother. It's like, here comes that thing that's gonna be the twist ending. All right, here it is. We're almost done.
Just one more miserable thing to get through before we can be happy.
Yeah, no, they're kind of like travelogues through like amazing countryside and brutal history. It's, I don't know.
And again, when he wants to be sort of weird and scary, I mean, I think Halpin Fraser really, really works as a ghost story.
Yeah.
And the deliberate obscuration, is that a word? The deliberate confusion of what's actually happening in the story, which is so unusual for Bierce in a war story, adds to the horror because you have to sort of suss out what's going on and what is, and so you're then complicit in horrifying yourself, and that sort of happens another way in Suitable Surroundings, the story about the guy who reads the ghost story and dies of fright, or does he? Which is another great Bierce story, and is got just the same, and of course it's about a writer being petty, which is, you know, one of the great human truths, I think, and and those stories just work, and they work really well. And so even mediocre Bierce is still okay. I mean, the very, very late Soldier Folk, they're like his four little, and they're Ripley's Believe It or Not ghost stories is what they are. You know, and it turned out you were dead all along. Bum, bum, bum. I mean, but they're a page and a half long. So by the time you're angry that it was only that, you're done with the story, and it carried you along. And it's light. It doesn't even begin to compare to the great stuff, the 1890s and 1880s Bierce, but it's still, you know, it's able, right? It does what it says in the jar.
So if you were going to write Ambrose's Bierce's death, how would you write Ambrose Bierce's death?
I mean, first of all, I think I discovered Bierce's death maybe via Charles Fort, who talks about how someone is collecting Ambroses, which may be one of the great mystifying sentences ever written. I talk about someone who I will follow off the edge of a cliff anywhere. Charles Fort is the guy.
Yeah, who's Charles Fort for the people out there who don't?
For the kids in the cheap seats? Charles Fort is a collector of damned facts. And by damned facts, he means facts that do not fit into dominant paradigms.
Gotcha.
So he's comets that no one predicted, and fish that fall out of a clear sky, and disappearing Ambroses, and giant spindle-shaped UFOs that cross the planet Saturn, and all kinds of other things, and just any number of weird events, to the extent that any collection of weird events is called a Fortean collection, and the Fortean Times magazine continues the good work even now.
All right.
And he wrote in this sort of jaunty, vim-filled, fin de siècle style. He's speaking of Theodore Dreiser. Theodore Dreiser was a giant fan of Charles Fort and sponsored the Charles Fort Society and was a big booster of Fort. And he just basically had a small independent income, and so he spent it going to the New York Public Library and the British Museum Library and just finding articles about weird stuff and then turning them into books. And and beautifully, and I think instructively, and this has suddenly become the Charles Fort hour, but I will talk forever on Charles Fort unless forcibly stopped. Beautifully, he has no theory.
Oh, shoot. There goes my alarm.
Oops, there's the Charles Fort alarm. Someone is talking about Charles Fort too much. Get back on topic. So he has no overarching theory, and in fact, he hates all overarching theories, whether they're science theories or theosophy or any other sort of belief system, because his argument is the world is too strange. You can't explain it with a belief system. Belief systems fall apart at the edges. And in a way, that same sort of belief, although much darker and meaner, is at the core of Bierce, is that anything you believe about America or politics or God or true love or humanity falls apart under stress. Run your beliefs about the noble nature of humanity through the Civil War. See what comes out the other side. Bierce is here to tell you nothing, literally nothing. Ground meat comes out the other side. And go look at Washington if you believe that democracy is great. Go look at anyone acting in their own personal life if you believe that people are unselfish. And so, to an extent, Bierce has sort of a moral Forteanism in that he finds things that don't fit a moral framework, and then he makes those the focus of his story. Or whether the moral framework is the world is a trash heap, which is not technically. Nihilism is not a moral stance. I think we can all agree on that. I mean, it may or may not be diagnostic, and in my bad moods, I find it very hard to refute. But still, I think we can argue that Bierce is an ironist, not a moralist, and would have only contempt for moralists. And so when Bierce vanishes, Bierce would be the last person to want you to make a big thing out of it. Bierce would want his death to not be mysterious and fun, although of course he delighted in doing the mystery. His last letter is, "I depart now for an unknown destination." And you don't write that if you're not trying to play up to it. But Bierce, the writer, would look at Bierce, the author, the guy, and say, "Oh, this guy's just he doesn't even have a glamorous death. He's trying to get killed by Pancho Villa. He gets dysentery, and he just shits out his insides in some ditch." And that's what happens to Ambrose Bierce, the great observer of the world. Doesn't see the tiny little microbes in his food and dies.
Yeah.
And I think that, if you're doing a Biercean view of Bierce, then you owe it to Bierce to make it as unglamorous and awful a death as you can possibly come up with. Now, I'm not a Biercean, so I'm free to have him kidnapped by a crazy spindle-shaped UFO along with Ambrose Small and Ambrose Burnside, for all that matters, and have them, form the League of Transcontinental Ambroses and fight the railroads forever. I mean, I'm totally happy with that being the end. That he has some sort of bizarre miracle salvation because, he walks into Carcosa, for example. Let's go there. That Chambers has opened the door for him wide enough that he can walk into Carcosa again, despite having seen his own grave in the nightmare that spawned that.
So I was going to ask you, hey, what about a breakdown of a typical Ambrose Bierce? But I think we've kind of done that of the beautiful landscape descriptions of people being terrible and violence, and then the twist.
And again, by twist, I think the people, I think I prefer to look at it as tragedy.
Yes.
But the tragic flaw is, oh, you're a person. Yeah. As opposed to the tragic flaw is, oh, you killed King Duncan or something. The tragic flaw is, nope, you're a human being. You're screwed. Sorry. Thanks for playing. And so it's not a surprise. Oh, he killed his twin brother. I mean, a child of 4 would see that coming once the twin brother is mentioned in Mockingbird. And in the Leap story, the name of which escapes me again, he's as much as comes out and says the guy's my father. So that's why I have to shoot the horse. And so it's not a twist. It's a inevitability, right? And I think that's what Bierce wants you to take away from it, is that, no, if you walk into something like a civil war or like the planet Earth,
kind of the furthest from cosmic horror, more like personal horror.
Right, yeah. But it's a personal horror that reflects the nature of, if not the universe, certainly the nature of humanity.
Certainly.
I mean, again, you talk about his nature writing, and I don't believe that he thinks that the Earth itself is damned, is created by, a demon. I think he thinks the Earth is just fine if it ticks along without us.
Sure.
But once you try to apply human goals or morality or thought to it, that's when you are going to be eaten by an invisible panther.
Well, that's what you get.
Yep.
If someone likes Bierce, who would you recommend?
You mean as another writer who's doing Biercean material?
Yeah.
I think part of it is, why do they like Bierce? Do they like the sort of the stark horror of the war stories? I mean, Stephen Vincent Benet is obviously the next guy up with Red Branch of Courage, or Eric Remarque, White on the Western Front. Any of those sort of, or just nonfiction about battles like Dien Bien Phu or Stalingrad or something that are just awful. Those are sort of in many ways, the child of Bierce is the attempt to build a picture of a battle from a million meaningless firefights that we have in military history. As an author, I think Guy de Maupassant is another guy that is very Biercean, but Maupassant still, despite literally dying of syphilis while he's writing these, feels like he wants to have life mean something. And so in a way, Maupassant stuff is even more tragic if it's just as, formulaic is the wrong word, but just as predestined as Bierce. And I think if you haven't read Maupassant, I mean, you can start with the Horla and say, oh, that's how to do an invisible monster story, Ambrose. But there's lots of stories that are also very Maupassant-y. And I assume, although I don't know for sure, that Bierce was reading de Maupassant in translation. I don't know to what extent Maupassant was being translated into English, but I assume it was pretty soon because the Horla gets translated very rapidly. I know that.
And I was going to make a joke about, why aren't there any RPGs based off of Ambrose Bierce's writing? But
I'll be very short and very sad.
I don't know, like Boot Hill came to mind, but everyone has like one hit point.
I mean, I think if Dennis Detwiller is ever looking for the perfect moment of man and material, his unique fun ruining approach to role playing games would be exactly the one for a Biercean game.
Yeah.
And Dennis has got that same grasp of universal bleakness and tragedy that I think would work very well. So yeah, Delta Green. Its incarnations. Do it in the Civil War. Take out all the monsters, except maybe the occasional Invisible Panther. And there's your Ambrose Bierce game.
Yep. Ken, thank you again so much for coming and talking to us about Bierce today.
No, thank you, and thank Dave for allowing me on by proxy.
Always great to have you on the show, and look forward to having you back again sometime soon.
Anytime.
But something I do want to...
What if Ambrose Bierce never existed at
all? But something I do want to talk about is like kind of like what nowadays I think we call the Jacob's Ladder scenario. Is I don't know if it's an invention of Ambrose Bierce. I'm sure there's probably some like Voltaire or something like that has like this kind of ending, but it's like something that like an occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, I think, really kind of brought this into like science fiction and horror. The whole concept of it never happened to begin with. You have an unreliable narrator who's telling you a story, but that story's bullshit.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm trying to think of any other examples, in literature for something like that. And by that I mean preceding examples, stuff that came before.
Oh yeah.
I mean, right off the top of my head, I'm not going to be able to.
Yeah,
I don't think I will be able to think of any real quick. I feel like there might be some out there. I don't know. The Gothic horror literature seems like there would be something there that would fall under this. Where like you said, the narrator is sort of unreliable.
Sure.
Or not trustworthy.
Yeah, no, and that makes me make my brain blink to Robert W. Chambers, who was definitely influenced by Bierce and wrote The King in Yellow, which was influenced by Ambrose Bierce.
I mean, yeah, the dude has a lot more feet in buckets than I think people think.
Oh yeah.
And I think the name Ambrose Bierce, which is a great 19th century name, I think I would say people might recognize the name, but he doesn't often get talked about a lot, especially if you move away from the Devil's Dictionary.
Sure.
But the point being, he had a ton of influence on stuff that we know and love these days. Not the least of which being Lovecraft, I believe, right?
Oh, sure. No, I just they just pick up so much stuff that is like, oh, Lovecraft read this, Lovecraft read this, Lovecraft read this. Something I was really surprised, though, is I think whoever the showrunner or the writer for The Walking Dead is or was during the pilot episode has had to have read Chickamauga by Ambrose Bierce, which is a brutal depiction of what Ambrose Bierce saw during his campaign in Atlanta during the Civil War. And thinking about like depictions of like someone crawling at you without their jaw across a field in Georgia, I'm like, that sounds a lot like Ambrose Bierce. And
it plays nicely in that world.
Yeah, I think to myself, I bet Ambrose Bierce would have either really, really, really loved or completely hated the whole zombie genre. And but yeah, no, I just like in the very first episode when like Rick's trying to figure out what's going on, there's a woman crawling across who doesn't have legs and doesn't have a jaw. It's just like arms and a torso and part of a face. And I'm like, that's Ambrose Bierce. Except for it was a living person and kind of messed him up for the rest of his life. But that'll do it to you. I mean,
I should say, if anything will.
if anything. Man, you know what would be a great note to go out on?
What's that? What are you thinking? I don't know. Just thinking about people crawling with no jaws.
Civil War, yeah, Civil War weird fiction. And it was like weird fiction before weird fiction was a thing. And it's this bizarre blend of supernatural horror, Civil War stories, and just kind of twist endings that really kind of get you and stick with you from middle school English classes and plays that you've been in and episodes of The Twilight Zone that get Oscars. And it's Ambrose Bierce. And yeah, it's, again, where can people track you down, and what do you got coming up in the near future? This is coming out in mid-July.
So you can always go to blurryphotos.org. I have all the archives up there for free to listen to. There's 300 plus episodes, extrasodes, like all kinds of stuff in there. On Apple Podcasts, Google Play, all the podcatchers should be up on there. You can find, just search Blurry Photos Podcast, and you should find it on just about everything. As for what I got coming up, so this will probably have come out after I have been to Alien Con in Los Angeles, where I have where I have moderated a panel on UFOs and podcasting. So hopefully I survived that, and that was fun, and the ancient aliens people didn't eat me alive. I don't have much planned per se for the rest of the year. I know there's some good topics I want to get to, but for the foreseeable future, it's just fun stuff. Like I just did an episode on Diglaka, the Nazi Belle, a couple months ago. That was fun. Did Irish vampires and Celtic monsters for a drink-a-sode. Had some Guinness and Jameson to celebrate the 8th season of Blurry Photos. So lots of stuff coming up, but stuff I'm going to keep secret, keep safe for now.
Nice. Yeah, no, and such a good show. I've been a big fan of it ever since I tracked down. I Googled Cthulhu Mythos, Ken Hite, because I was looking for an old episode of a podcast that I heard in 2004, and then I ran across Blurry Photos, and I'm like, this is amazing. A podcast dedicated to Fortiana. Man, this is like the zines we used to get back in the day.
Yeah, and then back at that time, so for I guess 6 seasons, I did it with a partner, Dave Stecco, and that was around the time he and I were still doing it together, and then he went off to start a family around about season 7, so it's just been me from then on. But those old episodes, we definitely had a lot of fun talking about the stuff, lots of jokes and making each other laugh as we discussed these topics. So you kind of get 2 shows in one in a way, which appeals to some people and is very annoying to others.
Yeah, it's like you listen to the first half, it's like skits and songs, and it's like the second half, it's like it's just David. It's just not as much skits and songs these days, I've noticed, but I still love it. I still love the show.
Well, I was never the one that could sing between us, so definitely not gonna be any.
What are you talking about between the two of you?
I was, out of the 2 of us who couldn't sing, I was the couldn't singiest one. Oh boy! But
well, thanks.
That's where you can find stuff.
Great to hear that. Well, thanks again for being on the show and helping us out with Ambrose Bierce, and I'm going to finish a bunch of other ad stuff after that, hopefully.
Well, it's my pleasure.
Well, thank you again, and we'll see you next time on Black Clock Audio Tales. Insert music here. Wow, everyone. This has been my favorite episode to record, edit and everything, but it also is a lot of hard work. About a month or so went into all of this, a lot of talking to people, chasing people down. And if you want to hear more episodes like this and less episodes where it's like me reading Wikipedia, donate some money. Donate $1 or $5 to paypal.me/pgttcm.com or paypal.me/pgttcm. Go to pgttcm.com, hit that patron button, and become a patron. Donate money. We're going to start doing some things for people who do things. If you like RPGs, we're going to have something like that. If you like coloring books, we got something like that. We're going to have some things. We've got stuff in the works. We've got stuff in the pipeline. We've got too many fires and like twice as many pokers in all of them. All right. Thank you again. If you want to help the show, I just told you how. If you want to check out the show, pgttcm.com. Remember, we have our monthly Cthulhu show and our daily audiobook show and our every once in a while one of these shows. And if you do want to hear one of these more often, let us know. Check out everything that Rodney's doing at rodneyanonymous.com. Check out Ken Hite at Ken and Robin Talk About Stuff, and check out David at blurryphotos.org. Everyone, thank you all for your amazing, awesome time. And thank you all for listening. You guys are great fans, and thank you for being here for the last 3, 4 years, 5 years. All right, bye.